Hello, Science 20. This is the Unit D, Chapter 2 part of the notes about changing populations. For the first little bit, we're going to be talking about just how populations rise and how do we start off with populations. And we're going to start looking at plant succession. And the first one we have is primary succession. And when we just have nothing, how do we get life in an area? So this is where we start with bare rock and we're working to reach a climax community, which is the most stable community. With this, it has to begin with what we call a pioneer species. And this is going to be something that can grow on relatively low soil or no soil because you're starting with bare rock. Once this happens, these things need to go through several life cycles where they die, they decompose, and they start to change into an organic matter base. And we call this humus. And this is the groundwork for what the soil will become in the area. This is the organic matter that will allow larger plants to actually live. Once this happens, once you actually start to get a soil base and some organic matter, you can actually start to see grasses and shrubs. And then finally, once there's enough of a soil base on top of this rock, you can actually get trees to start establishing. Eventually, this will become the climax community. It's stable and constant. However, disturbances can occur. And depending on the area, it's not always ending in trees. It usually is. But depending on the area, something like prairies, the most stable organism will be the grasses just because of the short growing season, the conditions. Having these grasses with some trees is the climax community. Different areas like a rainforest, well, they can sustain larger trees. Here you can see the graphic of primary succession and how you're starting off with the slow process of pioneer species, taking hundreds of years to develop a soil base on top of this bare rock. And from there, you start to see grasses start to creep in, and then you start to see shrubs and some larger trees starting to crawl in at the end until you finally get your climax community. And this can be shade tolerant trees because you're going to have trees that are creating more shade and not everything can get light down below. And you're going to start developing these long, slow growth trees. Key point here with primary succession, this takes hundreds of years to occur because you have to essentially create soil for these things to then grow in. After primary succession, secondary succession is another way that plant life can live and thrive. And this is where the entire ecosystem might be destroyed. However, the soil still remains and secondary succession can occur. So something like a wildfire or something that tears down all plant life, okay, you still have the soil base, but everything wasn't destroyed. This means grasses can arrive quicker, shrubs and trees can grow at a faster rate because even though they were destroyed, you can see there's still the soil base, and then it just takes time for these large trees to continue. And so with this, you see it takes about 100, 150 years, maybe 200 years until you have your climax, not hundreds. So here we can see two pictures from the same area and what it would have looked like with clear cutting. And so this would have been a human cause for destroying the area. But through secondary succession, we didn't touch the soil. We didn't scrape it with a bulldozer down to bare rock. There's still the soil base. And then 100 years later, you're starting to see all this growth happen. And it can happen quite quickly again. Succession can also happen in aquatic or marine areas as well. When water can actually stick around long enough so life can develop, you're going to start to see that it can start thriving pretty easily. And so this isn't just going to be like spring melt and where we have water standing for about a month or so. This is where the pond or the lake actually sticks around year round. And so it'll start with small organisms like algae, which then attracts insects and then larger animals because there's actually food there to eat. So that's the key, is it needs to be standing or have water constantly so animals can actually get attracted and plant life can actually establish. So with all this succession, a lot of national parks try to prevent secondary succession. Just like you saw, we don't want to clear cut, we don't want to cause forest fires because we want to enjoy the natural beauty of it. However, you can see this is the old method. Pause and think, why would we want to allow secondary succession? Why would we want to destroy what's there now to allow a regrowth to happen? Well, now we have to have actual controls, and we want to promote regrowth because returning nutrients back to the soil will actually make the forest healthier. They will naturally go through cycles of where forest fires will tear everything down and new growth needs to happen. And it adds nutrition back to the soil, actually making the forest healthier and healthier. So plant life actually needs to go through this cycling of matter. And so now we're trying to realize that we have to have this sustainable development in dealing with today's needs without jeopardizing tomorrow's or the future growth of things. And we need to control it, not just stop it. A lot of this chapter and this unit will be dealing with a lot of thought questions. So take some time, read through these questions, pause the video, and see if you can actually answer some of these questions. So when these plant populations go through changes, we can go through kind of modeling and what we see kind of with how things will grow. And so we've started to see trends and patterns that we see. Soon, when there's no competition like after a forest fire, there's lots and lots of rapid growth because the competition is so low. There's lots of space, there's lots of nutrients, and things can grow very quick. They have something called exponential growth. 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, and it's doubling every time. So you can see how fast 16 times 2, and then 32 times 2, 64 times 2, and it goes and goes and goes very, very fast. This exponential growth makes something they call a J curve. And this is troubling because even with the new pandemic results, they were worried about the exponential growth and the exponential spread and how fast and how high the numbers can get. And this is what was so troubling with the pandemic that we're currently facing. Here you can see what a J-shaped or a J-curve actually looks like, and that's why it's aptly named. You can see the line where this J forms. And the troubling part is how fast is that doubling? And so it's exponential, but does it double every 2 days, which is troubling? Or does it double every 2 weeks? Or does it double every 10 years? It depends how long that time span is. Either way, going through these quick, rapid doublings leads into a very, very sharp crash. With all these changes to the population, what are the factors that actually affect the population? Well, the first two are easy. There's births and there's deaths in the system. And that just makes sense. When you're doubling, you're going to be having more births than deaths. When you're going through this exponential curve, then well, that means you're having 2 births for every 1 death. And it's like, okay, you go faster, faster, faster. And then those 2 become 4, but then there's only 1 extra death. And then those 4 become 8, there's only 1 extra death, or maybe 2 extra deaths. And so you go through that very, very fast. But we also have some other factors when we talk about populations, and maybe more specifically when we talk about country populations. And so there is things like immigration, the people who enter, or something that enters into this system. And then there's emigration, where people are exiting or leaving. And so that's what I like to see when you look at the start, when we remember all this migration. If you're immigrating, you're coming in. So we start with an I, in. Emigration is an exiting migration. So these 4 factors, they're all part of open populations. This is where you could think of it on the country level. If you thought of Canada as a whole, Canada will be affected by all 4 of these factors because there's going to be births and deaths in Canada. There's also going to be people coming into Canada. There's also people leaving Canada to live somewhere else. These are all open populations, or these are open systems. Same thing could be said about forests. In a certain area, they are open because animals might come in and leave, animals might come out, animals will die, animals will be born there. It's all open. On the other case, when you think of a closed population, this could be a laboratory or zoo because there is no immigration or emigration. And so the only two factors that affect a closed population are going to be births and deaths. If you thought of the entire world with the human population as a good example, well, that's a closed system, right? There is no different people coming in or out on the whole world scale. The only thing that affects the world population is births and deaths. So this is the scary part because what stops a population then from just going out of control in light of our new pandemic that's popping up, and what's stopping this spread of the virus? Well, there's also going to be things that slow down population growths that cause more deaths and help balance it out. Or in our case with this pandemic, we're trying to social distance and reduce the spread and reduce this doubling time, and hopefully we start to develop a vaccine for it. But in natural populations, things that are affected, there's disease, competition, predators, there's natural disasters that help balance it out. And these are all called a carrying capacity, and they're the carrying capacity factors that help limit how fast and how large populations can actually grow. Because if you were to think, if everything was to grow that fast, you would just run out of space and food, and the environment cannot support this. The result is a S-curve, and it starts off very much the same as a J-curve where you have quick, rapid growth. However, once things start to develop more, they actually start to balance out. And it's not always such a clear line. It might go above that 100% and go below, and it might kind of wave. And more realistically, instead, it'll go up above, but then things will cause it to drop down, and then this little wave at the end will start to become flatter and flatter and flatter until it reaches stability. However, when we see this, this is a little bit more positive because we reach a maximum and we stay at that maximum and we find that balance. Take some time now to stop and review your workbooks and some of the questions and terms and practice the questions about all these new terms that we've just kind of been talking about. All right, so now we're going to jump into evolution and adaptations and how do things keep going and change in the environment as well. Another term we're going to come across is a generation. And so whether we're thinking in the human population or we're thinking in plant populations, a generation is a single step in a line of descendants. And so let's think of us. Let's use us as a good example. There's a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter. This is 3 generations. And so that whole kind of grouping, whatever your grandmother's age was, whatever your mother's age was, this was a general generation. And then they have offspring, that is the next generation. When we talk about these generations, what causes these changes in individuals? Well, it's these genetics. Genetics is what makes you sort of look like your parents. Okay, but what actually is genetics then? Well, it's the DNA that determines how you look, or it determines how organisms look. The genes are the basic unit of inheritance, and it's passed from your parents onto you, or it's passed on from the plant's parents onto its offspring or its offshoots that were happening. And it's a mixture of this random smattering of DNA, 50% from the mother, 50% from the father. And through this, you can have slight changes. This DNA can result in slight variations that can help or maybe cannot help organisms survive. Through these gradual DNA changes, adaptations can actually occur. These adaptations can either be structural or behavioral actions that help the animals survive better in the environment. An example is, why do giraffes have such long necks? Well, through competition, they could reach higher and higher without having other competition reach that high, giving them a natural advantage to reaching the highest leaves on the highest trees. This has been debated, and different scientists have thought through different things. A scientist named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck said these giraffes will actually change in their lifetime and they could actually stretch out their necks. Now, we know now that that's not such a good idea and that doesn't actually happen where we can change our physiological structure like that. But it allowed scientists to think, wait, maybe animals do change over time. Like when you see a polar bear. Well, sometimes you see a white black bear or a white brown bear. And wait, that looks very similar to a polar bear. Maybe there is these slight changes that these animals go through, and there's more to it than before. So there's three main adaptation types that we're going to categorize: physiological, structural, behavioral. Please take time to kind of work through some examples in your workbook. I didn't provide them, but I want you to work through your workbooks and try to think of some physiological, structural, or behavioral adaptations. Like I said before, the scientist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck said that these changes happen over a lifetime. Well, now we know that's not true, but there is a very slow, gradual change. And it's not just within the species itself and their lifetime, but through different generations. So this is called gradualism. Sometimes they can happen very, very quick in response to something, or sometimes they're very slow and they occur over very long periods of time. These quick changes, though, are called punctuated equilibrium. It's because the species needed to rapidly change to something that changed in their environment. And so this punctuated means it has to happen in a timely fashion, or else if they don't change, their species might die out. One example of this punctuated equilibrium was this peppered moth. Back in the 1700s, most of them were white with black spots because when they landed on the trees, most of the trees were white with black spots and they could blend in very, very easily. However, in the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution occurred, trees started to become covered in pollution, and there was no regulations at all on the environment back then. They had no idea that all this black soot and smog and everything was bad to breathe in, and it just was bad for the environment. So it was just everywhere, and it covered the trees. So these white trees all of a sudden became blackened, and this made it very easy for the birds to see white moths on a black tree. So instead of them slowly, gradually changing over time, they had to have this punctuated equilibrium. So it was very timely and it had to happen right now. And this population had to adapt very quickly. Even though it was not their choice, they had to adapt. And so this natural selection caused these black moths to actually survive. And therefore, this could be this example of punctuated equilibrium. So what else causes changes in populations then? If it's what us changing it, okay, that's one thing, but we haven't always been around to change the populations of past animals. How have they gone through so many cycles before? Well, they change on a lot of different things, whether it's just genetically and there's just slight mutations. And that's when you think of it as the ape families and why gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, and even humans are so similar yet so different. Or all types of dogs, how are they similar yet so different? Or other things like we learned about in geology when the plate tectonics move and we have these massive shifts in climate. Well, the organisms need to now change based off of these new climatic pressures. And hopefully we remember these tectonic plate changes or these climatic changes are usually relatively slow, so it keeps up with our slow, gradual adaptation changes. And so I'm going to try to have this link here, or I'll try to post it on the D12 homepage and we can try to click through and give an example of a virtual lab of this slow change as well. These adaptations led people to start thinking about how the actual natural world around them was starting to work. So Charles Darwin, we might have heard of him before, was the first kind of person that really put forth this idea of how things changed. And in his travels, he wanted to explain these Galapagos finches, how they all sort of looked the same, yet had very different structural features. And so the Galapagos Islands are very unique because they're quite far removed from mainland, so too far for these birds to fly back and forth all the time. And even between the islands, there is not much room for the birds to fly back and forth. It's just too far of a distance. So you could see that these islands that were once part of it had this life, but then they've changed over time. And over this time, these finches also adapted to the food available for them. And what he saw was overall, these birds looked pretty much the same. However, their beaks started to change based off of the food requirements on each of these islands. And so, depending whether they needed to eat small little seeds, or they were eating fruit, or they needed to peck and get into small little crevices, or they needed the big jaw to crack harder shell nuts, their beaks started to actually change. He came up with the theory of natural selection. Again, I'll try to post these video links as well with my notes, but what he saw was how did these birds slowly change? He didn't see them change in his life or when he was there, but he had the ideas that populations will start to overpopulate and there will be more individuals that will be able to survive. And so we see this with a J curve. There's going to be this rise, sudden explosion of life, and it will overpopulate an area. They'll all have variation, he thought, and all the individuals are not going to be the same. There's this variation, like we saw with these moths, or we saw with these adaptations that he had this idea that he was building on from Lamarck. They are then going to compete, and they're going to compete for survival. And with this, people will survive. And he had the idea of the survival of the fittest. This is what Darwin is known for, is that the fittest, the not the most in shape, but the animal that is best suited for the environment will actually survive. However, survival doesn't equate to evolution. Darwin thought those that were able to survive will most likely pass along their traits through reproduction. Darwin explained this as evolution, survival of the fittest. They'll overpopulate, and then the one best suited will survive and pass along, and they will pass along these traits, and that's how they will evolve. However, evolution is not predicated on that, and it's the ideas that time itself will cause these changes, and the species will change over time. So what evidence is there for evolution? On page 502, you can find pictures and examples that I've written out here, but you'll see the kind of pictures to help explain. So please make sure to go through your textbook for this. But we will see fossils and how they've changed over time. Modulus structures. And so when you think of it, like you could think of a whale fin versus a bat wing versus our own hand, they will have the same number of bones, but look very, very different. Similarity is amongst those embryos. And when we see images of embryos developing, they will all start off very much the same, but then they will grow and develop. Now, evolution helps explain this because, okay, we're starting from the same structure. It wasn't just we had this random mutation and we were best fit for the environment randomly at this set of time. No, it was a slow change and this variation where we started from the same. We have this vestigial structures. So our wisdom teeth no longer needed. On dogs, they have these dew claws, so these very high up claws that are just flat for the most part. Why do humans have a tailbone when we have no tail? Behaviors that we see. What kind of behaviors do we see? Why was the domesticated dog so friendly? How did that help them along? Or biogeography. They're separated, but yet they still sort of look the same. Horses and zebras. However, they're very different. So it comes back to sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. With asexual reproduction, This is the product of an identical offspring from a single parent. Whether you're taking a splice off of a tree and trying to plant it, or taking parts of a tree and trying to supplant it, okay, that's asexual. It will only have the genetic material makeup of the same parent. Through sexual reproduction, the offspring gets a different combination from the parent's genes, thus increasing the variety in the species, because now you're mixing up the DNA and you can increase the chances of survival this way. So this wraps up evolution versus natural selection. I will try to link some of these videos that I've had in my notes into the news feed. So please try to watch them. Please try to understand the differences between this Darwinian theory versus kind of our new accepted theory of evolution. And we will have our unit exam on Friday, May 8th. So please take time to work through your workbooks. Please answer the questions and prepare to hand them in once the unit test is done. Thank you and happy studying.